You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by...
Chrissy Mancini-Nichols.
Hey, Chrissy. Welcome back.
Hey, Jeff. Nice to be back.
Yes, it's so good to have you. I'm so excited to be talking to a person. We've had a couple of single episodes the last few weeks, and as fun as it is to write a script and learn all about this stuff by myself, it's always fun to talk with somebody else about it. So I appreciate you coming on the show, as always.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to be back and talking about the biggest thing to hit our industry since, I don't know.
Since the initial roads bill in the 20s itself, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's so much, there's so much stuff going on. Yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the infrastructure bill. There has many different names. The American Jobs Plan, the infrastructure bill. Some might say there's no infrastructure in it, although that's probably disputed. Yeah, so we're going to talk about this specific topic. And I want to say we're not going to go through every detail of it. Obviously, there's so much stuff to talk about. You could make a 10-hour podcast, I'm sure, but we're not going to talk about every detail. Is that okay with you?
No one will listen to a 10-hour podcast of just us going back and forth.
No, they don't want to hear that.
No one wants that.
Nobody wants that. And then also I want to note, before we get into that bigger topic of the infrastructure bill, we do have some really cool shows coming up. Today I recorded a show with former Seattle Mayor Mike McGinn talking about the MUTCD. He is with America Walks, and they have they're trying to lobby for some changes there. So that's exciting. We've had a couple of other folks on talking about commercial strips and districts and cities and commercial, retail in cities. And we talked about it in a different way than we did before. So a couple of cool episodes coming up on Talking Headways. So definitely check that out. And Monday's show, sometime soon, we're going to be talking about freeway opposition in Portland as well. So stay tuned for those. Obviously, they're coming in a little while. So this is episode 86 of Mondays at the Overhead Wire. Shut-ins Anonymous 101 is in session. And you all know the spiel: iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts. If you want to subscribe to the show, we appreciate that. But let's get to the topic that we want to talk about. Let's get to infrastructure plan. So, like I said, I have a few themes that I want to go over in the discussion before we get stuck all night talking about it. I want to talk about the general plan. I want to talk about the discussion overall at the moment in the media and through folks that we know. And I want to talk about how maybe, possibly, but maybe not, we're going to pay for it. So is it okay if I go through kind of the general plan, Chrissy, to start?
Yeah.
Just kind of an overview of the general stuff. I'm not going to get too in the weeds, but the general plan is going to be over $2 trillion over the next decade, and the Democrats say that it'll be fully paid off in 15 years. So there's $621 billion for transportation. That includes repair and renovations to roads, bridges, transit, passenger and freight rail, EVs, ports, waterways, airports, et cetera, reconnecting neighborhoods cut in half by freeways, those types of things. There's $50 billion for infrastructure resilience, like the electric grid, food systems, community health hospitals, and protecting people from wildfires and sea level rise. $111 billion for water infrastructure by replacing lead pipes, modernizing waste and drinking water infrastructure. $100 billion for broadband and connectivity, 100% coverage, and promote widespread adoption. $100 billion on power infrastructure, including transmission wires and clean electricity. $213 billion for building, preserving, and retrofitting 2 million homes and commercial buildings, as well as exclusionary zoning code changes, hopefully. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit. $100 billion to modernize schools and more for childcare facilities and community colleges. And then other parts include research and development, job training, workforce development, and such and such and so and so. So did I miss anything generally?
I don't think so, but I don't know.
I took it directly from the White House fact sheet. So
The fact
hopefully,
sheet.
hopefully they did well. And as usual, the fact sheet will be linked in the show notes. So if you want to read it from the horse's mouth, go there and check out the link. So Chrissy, what's your initial reaction generally to the infrastructure bill?
Well, as you were going through the list of funding priorities on the fact sheet and just reading all the commentary that we've seen over the past week and few days, I was starting to think about it as is this both fundamental and incremental change? We are always talking about how we want fundamental change, and we want our transportation system to be sustainable and modern and future looking. We want our tax system to be progressive. We want all of these things that are fundamental change, and that is really hard, because things happen incrementally. But I think this is about as fundamental as you can get, but it's also incremental at the same time, and that can make it passable. So I'm excited. So many times we talk about these proposals, and we work on these big priorities, and this is a big change. This is doubling the transit investment. This is ending parking minimums, which is, one of my pet projects. More money for transit than roads. This is a sea change from every single transportation investment ever in the history of our country. And I do think that it looks like there's a path here. There's enough here for Joe Manchin. Progressives do want more, like you were saying, but if there's any year that we can get a plan like this done, it's 2021.
Yeah, I like the scope. I like the ambition. Obviously, there's not going to be everything for everybody, and obviously, they're not going to build subways in every city. It's just not. I don't think that that's going to be a thing ever. As much as I would love it to be, there are folks always going to be saying that it's not enough, or on the other side there's too much. So it's going to be that push and pull. But I'm excited about the overall kind of enthusiasm for it. The idea that 2/3 of the American public wants this type of investment. I think that the other thing that really gets me going is just thinking about how over the last 30 years or something, we always talk about competitiveness. We always talk about investing in the future and what we do or not do or haven't done since the 50s. And I think this kind of turns around the ship of kind of the purpose for government. And the purpose for government is doing these kind of major things that invest in infrastructure, and that's social and physical infrastructure that will lay the groundwork for future generations. And so I think that that's super exciting. I'm really bummed that there are some folks that just can't see ahead of this and what this would actually mean. They're trying to limit it because they say it costs too much, or it's not really infrastructure, or whatever it is. We'll talk about that in a second. But I'm frustrated by that, but I'm emboldened by the fact that we're going to do something big and it's exciting. And I think that's what we want people to do. We don't want them to shirk their responsibilities. We want them to go big and bold. And if they fail, they fail. But if they get it done, then hallelujah, celebrate.
On that note, I see President Biden as this is his role to play. There's all these pandemics we're going through right now, between COVID, between racial justice, so many things happening. And I read that when Biden first took office, he had a meeting with several presidential historians like Doris Kearns Goodwin, John Meacham, and he wanted to talk to them about past presidents, how they enacted these big plans and policies like the New Deal or the Great Society. And he asked them, how did they get it done? Because those presidents were also facing unprecedented times like we are now, the space race, whatever it was. And he saw his role as a president, whether he's one term or two term, like this is his year to do something big because our country needs it. And what you're saying around we can show that government can do big things. I think with the vaccine rollout, he's shown the country the importance of government. And when you have competent people working in government, we can do hard things, and we can do things that are successful, and that's helping with his message around this. So it's clear that he's learning from his predecessors. I think his messaging is so on point, as he talks about this, and even as he talked about the last COVID relief bill. So he's trying to reimagine what our society will be. It's interesting that the oldest president in history of our country is bringing out this sea change in our infrastructure, but he sees that as his role.
Yeah, and that's good that he's the steward, right? He's not somebody that's supposed to be up there saying it's all about me, me, me. It's all about us, us, us. And I really, as a team player, I always appreciate that. There's been a like we said, there's been a lot of articles about this. One of the ones that kind of struck me specifically was right after they did they released the plan. Obviously, everybody has hot takes and stuff like that. But Jordan Weissman and Henry Gerbar, I always say Henry's name wrong, but in Slate, basically called it an economic modernization plan. And it was kind of stuck in their commentary, and it probably should have been picked out a little bit more. But I think that that's the main idea of this this plan, is that it's an economic modernization plan. Now, this isn't to be confused with the transportation bill, which usually comes out, every 6 years, or used to. And it's been a while now, obviously. But this is on top of that even. So this whole thing is a way for Biden and the administration and the United States to modernize and get with the program and catch up with some folks that maybe have gotten ahead of us, whether that's South Korea, whether that's China, whether that's Germany, in a number of different ways. So I think I think that if we were to frame it overall, I like that frame the best, that it's an economic modernization plan and getting into the 21st century.
Yeah, his messaging around China and China's investment in infrastructure, obviously Biden has support of many of the unions. And if you hear about Richard Trumka, who is the president of the AFL-CIO, I was watching an interview with him, and he was talking about the need to modernize our manufacturing. And, he was asked about something like the Keystone Pipeline. And he said, well, I wish that Biden would have announced this bill when he announced canceling the Keystone Pipeline. And I do think people see this as we need to modernize our manufacturing, our jobs, our economy. But Biden is also proposing a plan to make sure that those people who may not fall into that modernization have something to fall back on, with all the investments in training and manufacturing. So there's something there for everyone.
You can't just take something away and then expect people to be happy about it without something that can, go and give them an opportunity in another way. That's just bad politics, and it's bad policy overall. Just, if we say no more oil wells, no more, liquid fuel, but we don't give anybody an alternative, then why would they be happy about that? And obviously there's a change, and people don't like change, and we've been doing it this way for so long. But I think you're right. I think that we really do need to have something to kind of backfill some of those things. And that's a really good point about the Keystone Pipeline. If you would have introduced a bill that said we're going to do this, this, and this, but then that means some tough decisions like killing the Keystone Pipeline, it might have, come down a little bit easier. I think there's probably going to be a lot of those different announcements in that way with this bill specifically, because of all of the things that we're investing in, whether that's jobs, whether that's infrastructure, et cetera. Now, obviously, we can quibble with all the stuff that's inside of it in the deep end of looking down inside the bill. But, I think that's a good point about making sure that we're not just like making people lose their jobs and then not giving them anything to fall back on.
No, when you're talking about $16 billion to plug oil and gas wells, that's creating jobs, but it's also cleaning up our cities and places where, I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
Another $15 billion for pilot projects, that equals jobs. So, I do think that makes it a little less scary, because we know, like, clean energy, that's such a buzzword and a talking point. And I already know, we've seen that there's already super PACs that have raised $25 million to, message against this plan. So, I think Biden has to be out there talking about, and all the surrogates have to be out there talking about how much this invests in human infrastructure and in creating jobs for people that, work in mines or work in oil fields.
Yeah. Oh, and that's a good point too about the messaging in opposition. The interesting thing to me is that the opposition has been loud, but it isn't inspiring.
No.
It's not an opposite plan. It's not something where we can do this better this way. It's more like, let's not do this plan. It's the same thing kind of with the healthcare bill where, the opposition was saying, well, let's kill this bill, but they never gave you they never gave you an alternative. They never gave you something else to get inspired by. And so I think that's kind of the collective problem right now with the opposition overall, and wherever it comes from, is that there's no real, moonshot idealism from that corner of the market of ideas. I don't see any, the Republican call for only doing roads and bridges and, ports or whatever. That's not inspiring, and that's not going to get people excited, especially when everybody's on their computer at the moment doing this, that, and the other thing, or their phone, right?
Or
on the internet.
Or their internet's not working because they don't have broadband.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That sounds exciting to have 100% connectivity. That sounds exciting to be able to get access to healthcare through your internet. That sounds exciting to be able to do all these really cool whiz bang things that we were promised so many years ago with this investment. So that's been something that's been frustrating, is that pushback has not been very exciting. Maybe in the past and even in the past, maybe there wasn't that much excitement about it, but it kind of goes back to, I mentioned in my newsletter about Clayton Knoll's book, and we had Clayton on to talk about his book, The Road to Inequality, a couple of years ago. And basically the highway system created kind of an uneven political map where people who were more prone to vote a certain way moved out to the suburbs, and the folks that were more prone to vote the other way stayed in the cities or moved back into cities. And all of it was kind of facilitated by this infrastructure. And so it gave us this initially in the 50s and 60s, we had a kind of common, denominator as it pertained to infrastructure. But since this kind of big sorting, we have now, maybe because of the way that happened, we have this diverging definition of infrastructure. And now that's kind of the discussion point as well, is this actually infrastructure? And there was somebody today that said, is Russell Vought, the former OMB director, said that only 5 to 7% of the bill is infrastructure, which is an insane comment. All the things that I just read, everybody knows that's infrastructure. So, those types of things. Or, South Dakota Governor Chrissy Noem saying, I was shocked how much infrastructure isn't in there, that type of thing. And so I think we have this we're kind of diverging on our even definitions of things in infrastructure. So I found that interesting as well.
Yeah, I think if that's your vision of infrastructure, like, welcome to the 1950s. I mean, that is left. The train is left. It's infrastructure. This is about reimagining what our infrastructure can do to modernize our society, to right our wrongs, to create a more sustainable future, tying land use, jobs and transportation, and not just jobs created by the construction projects, but jobs, long-term jobs. And like you're saying, I think we want something exciting. I mean, any opposition to this, there is no plan. And the way that they're messaging it, and just the bill and the plan in general, I mean, there's something for everyone. You have all of the sustainability and electrification and research for progressives, talking about China, helping seniors age in place. Everyone has either a mom or a dad or aunt or uncle, someone they know that's aging, that, they're eventually going to need to deal with that. Even the way that he's talking about reducing congestion, and I know that there's a lot of discussion around what that actually means, but
right.
Messaging, if you're in a suburb and you drive to work, whenever you go back to work, that's great messaging for people that live in the suburbs. He doesn't have to exactly say that he's not going to widen roads, but he's talking about reducing congestion, reconnecting neighborhoods for the Black and Brown communities, and those communities, got Biden elected. Even today he's talking about his tax messaging, saying, I heard him, 55 out of the top Fortune 5 companies don't pay taxes. So I think whatever your definition of infrastructure it's in this bill. So his messaging is great, but I do think in the end, the opposition, they're going to use budget reconciliation. So as long as there's a lot in here for Joe Manchin, Mitch McConnell already says he's opposed to the bill. So, what
he wasn't going to be for it ever.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what Republican in Congress right now doesn't regret not passing an infrastructure bill during the past 4 years during Trump's first term? They could have passed an infrastructure bill. They could have gotten bipartisan support. I'm sure they regret not doing that because they could have cut ribbons for 3 years. I don't know. They're only going to pass with Democrats. So it's just keeping everyone in line.
Keeping the 3 to 5 to 6 senators that are kind of the centrist. I hate using that word centrist. They're more conservative Democrats. Keeping them happy is what's going to get this thing passed. Because today Schumer announced that he had come to an agreement with or at least understanding with the parliamentarian about whether they can go back and do another reconciliation this year, which is they said yes. So that's one of the things, if you're gonna pass a big thing like this, you're gonna have to do it that way specifically, because there's it's going to be that's another thing that Joe Biden learned from the Obama administration was during the Great Recession and the aftermath of the housing crash. They kind of dawdled a bit because the Republicans said that they would work with them, and then they kept on kicking the can down the road. And now they're just like, you know what, you've pulled the football so many times, we don't believe you anymore. And so it's time to just move forward and get stuff done, because if they don't get stuff done and it gets, nobody cares about budget reconciliation, and nobody cares about, outside the Beltway anyways, nobody cares about that stuff, that inside baseball stuff.
No one even knows what that means.
Nobody even knows what it means, right? And so if you get stuff done, you're seen as getting stuff done. How you get it done is another matter. So I think people are sick of all the kind of the gridlock in the Senate and in Congress over the last decade or so. I think that however they get it done, they get it done. But I think it's the way they're going forward now is a good way forward. I want to go back to something you said about congestion and thinking about access, thinking about our messaging around all these things. I find it also interesting when we talk about infrastructure generally and talking about those jobs numbers specifically. Like, I would actually rather, and I know that this is kind of nitpicking, but I would actually rather we not talk about how many jobs the money creates. I like that it creates jobs, and I know it will create jobs, but I want to give people access to jobs, not necessarily give them jobs from building it. Because I think in some instances, and this is what, I've been talking a lot about the podcast I did with Carol Martins, and it really impacted me, my discussion with him, because, we want to give people sufficient access to where they want to go. And if you're building projects because you're building them because you're just giving somebody a job, it doesn't really mean that was a good project or not. So I hope that they focus on, and this is a part of the problem with the whole infrastructure bill in itself. And, this is why Bent Flyberg wrote an article about big projects, was because you're not going to change the world with one or two big projects. You're going to change it with the smaller things, the smaller details that go into each of these, and making sure that you have a plan that makes sure that everybody has access. So I think that we should be also, kind of wary of how we talk about it. And I don't disagree with you that congestion kind of hits people in different ways wherever they are. But you did see that T4 stuff from Beth Osborne saying that they were worried about the language saying congestion, but ultimately, I don't think you're going to be able to turn that aircraft carrier that fast on the language people use. It's kind of like accident versus collision, or even some of the other things that we've seen have changed. They do change eventually, but you got to keep hitting on them to make sure it happens.
Yeah, and when I worked at Metropolitan Planning Council, we always talked about congestion as a way to gain support for taxes on infrastructure, to build infrastructure, which we meant buses and congestion pricing and other things not related to road widening. But we talked about it as congestion because, we were spending $7.3 billion. I'll remember that number forever. Well,
It's stuck in your brain.
Lost productivity on because of congestion. But to your point about what that means, that's to be seen in the details. The fix it first or fix it right, not fix it first messaging.
Right.
The messages are there. We just need to see the plan. And that's the start of this process, the negotiation, everyone, advocates getting their language in, that's where all the cookies will be made, or however you want to talk about it. But
Right.
Your point on the economy and jobs, and not just talking about construction jobs, it's such a valid one. We want to create places that we go to and not through, and so much of our infrastructure creates places where we go through. Going through a place doesn't create jobs. Going to a place creates jobs. And that's why I think in this plan, with all the human infrastructure and everything that's not related to roads and bridges, you can talk about those job benefits to people across all industries, not just transportation. So, it's going to appeal to people in so many ways, beyond just we're going to provide you better bus service or give you safer streets. We're going to provide you with housing jobs, or your neighborhood is going to look different, and therefore people are going to want to walk around more, so your businesses will have more economic activity. I mean, there's a lot to talk about in terms of local economic development here that many people can relate to, not just the unions or construction workers.
And I think an illustrative example of kind of that general idea is the investment that we made initially in the internet. It was a defense project. It was something that was put together with R&D money. And now look how many jobs the internet has related to it. I mean, nobody would have planned to have so many, some of these things. But if you make the investment in this infrastructure, then it'll let, millions of flowers bloom. And so, nobody could have guessed that you would have had iPhones and you would have had all these programs that allow you to increase your productivity, Microsoft Word, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what that initial investment in that one thing did, and eventually kind of blew up into this global, economy, and changed the world to what it is now. And so anytime we talk about investments in infrastructure or even research and development on different things, we never are quite sure where it's going to go. And, you might as well place little tiny bets everywhere so that maybe one of those will pay off. And then eventually you'll have a whole economy structured around something.
So I think that's a great point. We spent this large federal investment a long time ago on what is today's internet. And when people are talking about this plan and this isn't enough money to solve our climate challenges, no, it's not. But it's going to leverage a lot of state and local funds, private capital. When you look at the housing dollars, someone wrote, well, this is about $150,000 per affordable house. In San Francisco, that's not going to build one affordable unit. But it's going to leverage other money. And so this $2 trillion, whatever it ends up being, will actually be, it can leverage 10 trillion, 20 trillion. We don't necessarily know yet.
Yeah, there's a multiplier effect on all those investments that are made if they're made correctly, right? That could be infinitesimal in terms of how much you get out of it. I'm really impressed with the breadth of the investments and smaller ideas that are starting to kind of bloom as well, like the idea of care infrastructure, right? I mean, that's a really important thing, thinking about childcare, thinking about home health care. I mean, obviously my grandmother is benefiting because she can pay for folks to stay with her all the time, which a lot of folks might not be able to do. But we need that kind of infrastructure to help people live long, healthy lives. And it starts from when you're a young child and having the care infrastructure that's necessary to allow your parents to go and work or do whatever it is that they need to do. And then as you grow up, you have school, and then you have, job education, you have college, et cetera. So it's investment in the life cycle of a person. which is, I think, really important. And, somebody might not call that infrastructure, but I still think it is. And I think it's important that we're starting to call that out.
Yeah, it's human infrastructure. I don't see the difference. I mean, we have
Yeah.
to modernize what we think in terms of infrastructure, and it's the point of these investments in childcare. I mean, we've just gone through a pandemic. If you have children in their home, it's impossible. It's been impossible for people to work. I mean, those are economic investments that we'll make as a society that will bring untold amounts of returns. So yeah, I mean, I when we first, our first investment in the highway system didn't include all the things that we look to as infrastructure today. So I don't understand this roads and bridges only. It's just kind of it's a worthless argument, but I'm sure it'll be a big messaging statement.
Right. And hopefully it will be something that kind of falls on deaf ears, because people are starting to realize that they need the stuff that they need. They need internet connectivity. They need roads and bridges to be up, and they need to get to where they want to go, whether that's to work or to friends or to play, whatever it might be. The next question I have kind of is like, how are we going to pay for this, right? Like, so obviously that's a big talking point. Folks are always going to be asking, how do you pay for things? Obviously the federal government is not like you and I as individual citizens and people who can have a budget for a certain amount of money every year to pay for things. And so we have to not buy that thing that maybe we don't want or we don't need or we can't afford. But the government seems to be able to print money, and actually sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes it's a bad thing. But there's always going to be a discussion about how you pay for like a big infrastructure bill like this, which should eventually pay for itself through the returns that aren't necessarily direct returns, but they're going to be generational returns, like we were talking about for the internet and things like that. So it's interesting to hear the discussions about how we're going to pay for this specifically.
Yeah, and relying on corporations to pay for infrastructure. It's, I think in terms of how I hear people talking about it, people in support of this plan, they're really focusing on that a lot of corporations don't pay taxes. So, this is only their fair share. They use a lot of infrastructure because there's so much human infrastructure as part of this plan. It only makes sense to tax corporations. Things like the ramping up IRS enforcement, just reading about that proposal, it could bring in like $7.5 trillion. If we just invested in more staff at the IRS to go after people who don't pay their taxes. So, some of these proposals, how can you be opposed to something like ramping up IRS enforcement? But, obviously, this is a strategy to pay for this plan. It's not there's no discussion on the gas tax or VMT or vehicle mileage travel tax or congestion pricing, any of those funding sources. So, we'll see where that goes, and we'll see what happens with reauthorization of the transportation bill in September.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was an interesting, dust up about VMT the other day, because Buttigieg mentioned that, it might be a good idea to look at. And everybody freaked out one way or the other, whether you like him or don't like, Pete Buttigieg, you might have had an opinion on the VMT. And it might also have an opinion on VMT, whether or not you did like or didn't like him. But it seemed to color a lot of people's opinions about that specific topic. And then later he had to come out and say through his spokesperson, and he said it himself, that it wasn't for consideration in this specific plan or even maybe the transportation bill. So it's interesting. They're floating things. They're trial balloons of sorts. And that one kind of crashed and burned because of some of the opposition. I don't understand why, people don't see how that's much different than the gas tax. I mean, I guess it's a use tax like the gas tax is specifically. So, it's only making electric vehicles pay. And I understand some of the arguments about people who live in rural areas or drive further in a general sense. But then when you look at the numbers, maybe they might drive once a week instead of maybe every day. And the commuter, suburban commuter, seems to be the one that takes up a lot of those VMT distances. So it's interesting to see those arguments. And I at the moment, I'm not one way or the other on it, because I really would love to look into like the details of how it's equitable or not equitable, or how much people would be paying. Obviously, they're doing those pilot projects in Oregon and other places. So we'll get the numbers and then see if it worked or not. But putting stuff off the table immediately is a little bit frustrating. Saying no, we're not touching the gas tax. It's a done thing. We're not going to touch VMT. And then this whole discussion about paying for things. You ask certain sectors of government, well, how do you want to pay for it? And then they give you these weird answers like, well, the improvement of the economy will pay it back. And it's like, that's not how this works.
Trickle down economics.
That's not how this works. So that's frustrating too. But it's interesting to think about all of these things that people get frustrated by, especially regular workers. They're frustrated when they see that Amazon doesn't pay any taxes. They're frustrated when they see that people aren't paying their fair share. So these are kind of almost easy wins to a certain extent, because it seems like these are things that should have been done a long time ago. Your thing about the IRS, I do meticulous tax records for my business, and I almost want somebody to come in and tell me I did a good job. Like I'm not asking I'm not asking the IRS to come and audit me, but I think I did a pretty good job of figuring out what went where and everything like that. And so if they ever came, I'd have all the information for them. And then so ramping up enforcement on these people, I work hard and I pay my taxes, and I'm proud to pay my taxes. But all these people that don't, that's really frustrating. If it's trillions of dollars, that's really frustrating. And so I think that people can get behind that too.
Yeah, I don't really understand that, just not paying your taxes. So
I don't know how you get away with it, but apparently you do.
Yeah.
Apparently you do.
Yeah, but I think the taxes that are proposed for this plan are easier to sell because of all the things. Well, first, no tax is easy to sell, but I think there are a lot of good messages on the taxes proposed because of all the points you make. On the VMT, I remember when Secretary LaHood's first congressional hearing, and he mentioned raising the gas tax or indexing the gas tax, and he had to come out the very next day and say, no, we're not doing that. I do hate when they take things off the table, but the VMT, there needs to be a big educational component around what it is, how it affects people, because it is a change. It would be more difficult to implement, but it's not an easy tax to implement. But I think there's just, before we talk about that, we need to talk to people about what is a VMT, how would they benefit from it, how, who's going to pay more, who's going to pay less, because there's all kinds of ways to structure tax credits for rural resident, low-income people, So we want to talk about where Biden is on one hand making all these investments in electric vehicles. That's only going to diminish all of our transportation funding. So I think he needs to start talking about, if we want to electrify personal vehicles, there has to be some kind of consumer price on that electricity, or how much they're driving, some way to put money back into the infrastructure they're using.
What do you think of, there's this discussion that's popped up in the last week about EV chargers, right? And whether they should be paid for privately or paid for publicly. I'm of the mind that we need to kind of change over as fast as possible. And so if that means that we have to make an initial investment, and then later on we can figure out a way for, the oil companies or whoever else to change their gas stations over to electric chargers, whatever that is. But what do you think of that? There's discussions like that happening on every detail of the bill, and they're fascinating. But I'm wondering, how that kind of gets to a final bill, and which ones catch on and which ones kind of die out.
So I do think that the private sector has to invest in EV chargers if they want their products to go to market. But I personally, I'm working on, I implemented an electric vehicle microtransit program in a low-income rural community. I'm working with the California Air Resources Board on looking at how to bring more electric vehicles to places with unhealthy air quality. And it is almost impossible to adopt any electric vehicle mass, consumer acceptance without the charging infrastructure and without fast chargers, not level 1 chargers. And that's just not going to happen in low income communities, in urban and rural areas without public investment. Renters, for example, they often can't install the chargers at their home because their landlords don't permit that. There's just not enough public chargers around. I think that you need that public investment to make mass adoption happen. I mean, so under Obama, under his American Recovery Act, he had a lot of tax credits for purchasing electric vehicles. I think we're at 1% of all consumer vehicles are electric. So clearly those tax rebates, they're not working. So if we want to electrify, we really need the charging infrastructure and we need to upgrade the grid. And so to make sure that we can have fast chargers, and it has to be a public investment. There will be private investment, but it has to be both.
Yeah, I think you have to get the ball rolling to a certain extent.
Same
thing with, go ahead.
I was just going to add, it's not just about electric vehicle charging infrastructure, though. And this is what I'm interested to see in the details of this plan, but it's about how those electric chargers are powered. So are they powered by solar or wind? Are they powered by a microgrid? And what does that look like? Who's going to fund that? There's a lot of money right now in California to fund microgrids. There's a bill right now in Congress that would fund public microgrids. Interestingly, transit agencies are not an eligible entity to receive those funds.
That's strange.
So I've been writing letters to all of the sponsors. But I think we need to think about how transit agencies, for example, in California, a transit agency cannot purchase a non-electric vehicle beginning in the year 2029. I mean, every transit agency needs to have an electric vehicle readiness plan. So they're going to need a massive amount of charging infrastructure, and it shouldn't be microgrids, especially in a state that has a lot of sun and wind and climate issues. And and microgrids can also provide battery backup for when we have an emergency and the power grid goes out. So I think we need to think differently about it's not just about thinking differently about our infrastructure, but what can our infrastructure agencies be to the community? And hopefully that this bill and this discussion will start thinking about that. Like if a transit agency has a bunch of chargers for their buses, so they can open them up during the day to the public. That could be a station for a electric vehicle car share, bike share, a community hub. And I think we need to be more broad about what our agencies can even be to the community. And hopefully we can have that discussion.
Yeah, coordinated planning. I mean, that's really important. I mean, especially since all this stuff kind of overlaps. I mean, it's not just, like you said, it's not just chargers for the buses or for the bus barn itself. It's something that's a part of the overall community network. So it's really important, especially since we've had some of these natural disasters like the fires in California, or even the winter weather in the Texas area and further north. Those types of things, if we can kind of make ourselves more resilient against them by making these investments, I think that people will be on board with that too, because people have seen what's happened in the last couple of years with especially in Texas. I mean, Hurricane Harvey, you had the ice storm, the snowstorm, you had the power outages in California, you had the fires. Before the pandemic, I bought, actually for Christmas, I bought all my family masks because of the fires that happen every year. I was like, okay, here, everybody needs a mask. Here, you guys have one, because a couple of times a year now we have these fires which make the sky orange, and then we have a pandemic where they have to use it for something else. So that's kind of almost a little resilience lesson in itself, where I gave them this for this reason, but they needed to use it for another reason. And there's multiple different ways to go about it. So I think that's really interesting.
Well, that's it.
There's also.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm glad you brought that up, because there is the planning for retreat section of the plan. I
Yeah.
don't know exactly what it means, but it's about community-led transitions they talk about tribal communities and relocation. So, those details
Yeah.
I'm really interested to
Yeah,
see.
there was a New York Times article about that, and the flood insurance program, the all of the stuff with FEMA, the amount of money that people have been, we've been shelling out as a government to, kind of bail people out of some of the situations that they're in low water areas. We're going to have to redo the flood maps, and we've talked about that on the Monday show before. We're going to have to redo all that stuff, and so all of that and managed retreat is something that a lot of places are going to have to deal with. Or you're going to have to spend a lot of money building infrastructure for low-level coastal areas. I mean, there was an article recently about Louisiana and how they're going to spend billions of dollars trying to get the silt back kind of built up along some of those the jetties and some of the areas where the Mississippi flows out, so that they can make sure that land there won't just disappear because of the flows. So that's a whole other thing. I mean, we've engineered the Mississippi River. It should be going. I mean, if it had its druthers, New Orleans wouldn't even have a river anymore. It would be go down the Atchafalaya Basin. So the river has its own life, its own history, and things like that. But the Army Corps of Engineers has fixed it up so much that we're kind of forced to push it a different direction. That's neither here nor there. But there's all this interesting history behind all the stuff that we do. There's also this discussion about housing too. I mean, I like I said about care infrastructure earlier, I like that we're including housing and infrastructure as well. I don't know if you had thought about a little bit more about that as well.
Well, we're both children of the Sustainable Communities Act, where HUD, EPA, and DOT worked together for the first time, and then never again. Maybe
we'll get there again. We'll get there again.
Well, I think this is doing that. All of the 20. Well, there's I think 213 billion for housing, and we built 2 million affordable homes, 40 billion for public housing, and this program that would promote eliminating exclusionary housing policies. That is a huge policy. That's a huge stick and carrot, or I guess a carrot. So
it's interesting you say that, because there was an article about carrots and sticks, and how it's all carrots and no sticks, and people like that because it doesn't make it goes against that kind of trope that was thrown against the Biden administration during the election about destroying your suburb or whatever. So this is just if you can elect to do it if you want to, but you don't have to, which is frustrating to a certain extent here in California with places like Atherton. But we'll take what we can get to start, I would say.
Well, I do think on housing, if they're willing to give, I agree, some communities won't take the money because they don't need it, and they don't want to build affordable housing or any housing. But a lot of communities will. And if there is this pot of funds out there, I don't know if this is the race to the top funds that they were talking about or what, but if there is this pot of funds out there that allows a community to receive funding if they eliminate exclusionary exclusionary policies, if they eliminate these parking requirements, a lot of communities are going to take that, because there are state requirements in California and other places for mandatory affordable housing minimums. So this can help get cities to those minimums. In California, if you don't meet your minimums, or if you're not on plan, then you have to start paying a fine. Atherton will just pay the fine, but a lot of cities won't.
Yeah, and yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, and then I think that's what I was wanted to ask you. Do you think that this is the plan we've been waiting for? Because so much of what I was thinking in terms of the opposition and regretting that in the 4 years, Republicans probably regret not passing an infrastructure bill. And what it would have looked like had they passed their own bill and with their own vision compared to what this looks like, what we're talking about today. I mean, do you think that this is the plan that we've been waiting for?
That's the plan that we've been waiting for. It's not the plan that they've been waiting for. But their plan that they floated a number of times and nobody liked it. Nobody liked it. Nobody liked their plan. Some of the Republicans didn't like their plan. They wanted to do everything with privatization. They wanted to make it so that you build roads and then you have the same toll road kind of ideas where you're putting money into this and then somebody else gets the profits of it. Somebody else gets the money out of it. It's a grifter. It was a grifter transportation bill for the most part. And I think there's a lot of people who are like, well, that's not investing in infrastructure. That's looting. So I think that there's a lot of difference, obviously, between this one and that one. And then you have, everybody on the left has an idea of what they want the infrastructure bill to look like, an idea of what they want a Green New Deal to look like, and they want to make these investments in the future. And they're all pulling somewhat in the same direction. You might have a spare person going off in this, that, and the other thing, and it might be the far left and it might be the center left. But it's mostly pulling in the same direction, whereas the other bill from last year, or even not the one that Congress did, theirs was super progressive, getting ready for this. I think actually, the one that previously had got floated by the Trump administration was just kind of like it spawned the joke about Infrastructure Week. They wanted to do this bill that nobody liked, not even Republicans liked, and so they have to, if they want to kind of win the hearts and minds of people who are, thinking about, cities and states and people who need this money to invest in their futures, they need to come up with something a little bit more fantastic and a little bit more inspiring. And I think that's what this bill has done for us. I mean, folks have been paying attention to this for a long time. I mean, the reason why, Tea for America exists is because they wanted to, Smart Growth America, Reconnecting America, a lot of the funders, they wanted to get together and have a focus on a transportation bill that could be transformative. And we're finally, I think, this is actually the culmination of that back in 2008, 2009, 2010, right? So this is a long game that's been being played. And so this is something, while not perfect, while it has things that everybody wants something more out of it. I want all subways, but for what it is, I think that I'm super excited about it. I'm super jazzed about pulling for it. Writing letters. A lot of times when you're not excited about something, you're kind of just meh about it, right? If there's something to oppose, there's something to oppose. But it's hard to get something that you're excited about that you'll pull towards. Usually you're just like, okay, well, that's cool. I'm just going to go about my business. And that's a lot of what housing is in the Bay Area, right? A lot of opposition because people get fired up, but not a lot of excitement because it's not, a project that might, benefit you. So I think it's exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. I am a little worried about getting to 50, but you do what you can.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I like the way you frame that, because thinking about, I worked on a couple of federal bills, and it was the federal transportation bills, and it's like, yeah, it was exciting, but it wasn't this transformative. We're always looking at what are the little things we can do here and there and tweak this policy, or make some competitive grants happen. It wasn't just this big change. And talking about what was proposed over the past 4 years, mostly a transportation infrastructure bill funded by public-private partnerships, having worked on P3s for parking, highways, transit, airports, that would not be the vision for this broad thinking about public infrastructure, human infrastructure, returning the public realm to the people, all of the things that we work on and people that listening to this podcast work on every day. The things we try to convince our city councils or planning commissions to do, this plan helps us do that. And I know I saw Transportation for America was talking a lot about, there's so much investment in infrastructure is from the state. We have to look at, will the state be able to just, swap this money with state money and still plan on widening roads? And I think that's where the sticks could come in, thinking about how this bill will actually, what the language is. But the federal government, they provide a lot of matching funds. On almost every infrastructure project I work on, there's this matching fund, and it goes a long way. So this plan, we're really thinking about the sustainable future, sustainable infrastructure that meets our needs. That can provide that local vision for how we reimagine our cities, our suburbs, our communities, and I'm excited. I think it will. Everything's hard to get to 50, but there's something in here for everyone. So I think it has the best chance of passing of anything we've seen in the past, I don't know, couple decades.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so we'll be watching it for sure. I think we're probably at a stopping point in terms of talking about this week, but I think we'll be talking about it probably for the next few months. How the deals go down, how the process happens, what's in it, maybe more in detail, taking certain sections of the plan. I know that there's a lot of little tweaks in there that are going to be very exciting to people. There might be some things that aren't so exciting to folks, but we'll get. I think that the general kind of idea of it, I think that's what we wanted to talk about today. I think we got a good idea of what's going on and what we're excited about. So that's a good thing to end on. So this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and the Talking Headways podcast really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month, and you'll get some stickers and a handwritten note. And $10 a month, and you'll get one of our bus-only scarves, which is back. If you want a bus-only scarf, you can also go to theoverheadwire.com. They're awesome. It's still a little chilly outside here in San Francisco, so if you want one, dial us up, and we'll get it for you. I also got some really cool cards. I got some old travel poster cards. So I have
nice.
some new, actually I should show you. So the vintage travel posters. So I don't know if you can see this, but like from Italy, from Canada, from England, and they're like old railway, posters. And it said, let's see, what one of these says, Florence par le train de luxe Rome Express. So there's their travel posters that tell you how you can get there by train. So if you want one of those, feel free to donate to the cause here. And also, don't forget, you can get Town Planning in Practice at raymondunwin.com. And it's American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books of Planning. You can listen to it like a podcast. Definitely do that. If you have any listener questions or comments, feel free to message us. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the infrastructure bill. Long replies, short replies, tweets, messages, whatever you want to do, shoot us a note, and we'll read it out on the air. And then finally, as you know and love, as I've talked about many times, puppies and butterflies. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, and maybe it just didn't fit in other sections. My first question for puppies and butterflies for Chrissy is the Suez Canal open?
It is open.
As of this recording, the Suez Canal is open. What do you think of that whole madness?
Crazy. It was interesting to see the whole world focused on this one ship and bringing attention to how interconnected we are as a global economy. And I learned so much about container ships, and because sometimes I go for a walk, if there's a ship coming in under the Golden Gate, and if you catch it at the right angle, it just looks like the ship. You can't see the water, you can't see the mountains behind. You just see this ship, and it looks like a gigantic building. So the ship that was stuck, the size of the Empire State Building, I can't imagine.
They're so huge. They're so huge. Yeah, it was fascinating to see like that global community paying attention to this one ship, and I bet the captain could feel all of those eyeballs bearing down on him.
Oh my God, I can't imagine.
I think it was a him.
Sure
yeah, and Yeah, and so I can't even imagine what that person or even the folks that were in charge of the canal trying to do it out. And then all those memes that came out from the little backhoe that was working on this huge ship, trying to get this huge ship out, and all of the stuff it was apt because there's so many things you can say about trying to do little things to make big change. And I think that was kind of the theme for the last few weeks, I guess.
But in the end, it was Mother Nature and the full moon that raised the tide a couple inches that got the ship out. So
Yeah.
in the end, our climate, like, nature had its way.
Oh man, that
Saving
was a
us
good
again.
That would have been a good meme. One of my favorite lines in Star Wars is when Yoda meets Luke for the first time, and he goes, "Oh, cannot get your ship out." And I would have loved to see a meme of Yoda sitting next to the ship and saying,
Yeah.
"Oh, cannot get your ship
You
out."
should make that.
I totally. I might just go to Photoshop right after this and make that. Chrissy, where can folks find you online?
Twitter at Nancy New Chrissy and at mycuriouscity.com.
I love that, mycuriouscity.com. And you can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire, at theoverheadwire.com. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous Patreons for supporting this week's podcast. Thanks for Chrissy to coming on the show, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Talking